We're joined now by our senior military and political analyst, newest member of the Sekulow broadcast team, former member of Congress and presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi, I want to go to you first because on President Biden's announcement this week to run for re-election, we heard a lot about freedom. And we didn't hear a lot about what was going on in the world, but images of January 6th, issues like abortion, and then there's just talk of freedom. But it seems like under this administration, and we've seen even documents to see how they've tried to pressure social media companies to basically keep us from being able to have the right to free speech. So there's no freedom for people who have a counter view. You only have freedom under this administration's view of the First Amendment if you agree with their talking points.
Jordan, it's good to see you. And I thought the same thing when I saw that video. When I found that the DNC was not going to allow for any presidential primary debates for voters to be able to actually question and examine President Biden's record and compare and contrast it with others who are running. They talk about freedom. They talk about democracy. They talk about rights. But as you said, we are only free to speak if they find our speech acceptable. We can only examine facts and information and truth if they deem those things to be acceptable and truth and facts and information. There are so many different issues here that we could go down the list on, and we would find on just about all of them how the Biden administration is failing to meet that mark of actually upholding our God-given rights and freedoms enshrined in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. So to me, hearing his message was actually quite insulting, given how they are directly trying to undermine our freedoms at every turn.
Yeah, and the rest of the message just ignored all of the crises they've created around the world, which are just a mess and they affect us all here domestically. You brought up, too, I wanted to ask you about that specifically because you ran for president in the Democrat primary in 2020, and so you've seen this process. But the DNC has said it is not whether or not they can force Joe Biden to go to a debate. He can decide that, but they're not even going to hold debates, even though somewhat unexpectedly for, I guess, some inside the Democrat Party, you have a couple of candidates who announced RFK Jr., who's polling in some polls 21% of the vote, Democrat primary vote. Marianne Williamson back at 9% in some of these polls. You got 30% of Democrats saying they are not in these polls right now, that they would vote for someone else in the Democrat primary. And yet, again, this kind of idea, we saw it yesterday in the press conference, Tulsi, when he's got the card, and it's got the question, it's got the answer. He knows everything. So there's no actual, the press isn't holding him accountable at all. Even when it looks like they have an opportunity to ask him a question, they are literally all just actors with a script. And that, to me, is just very scary as an American.
It's scary, Jordan, and it's incredibly offensive because it really reveals what Joe Biden and his administration and his kind of whole cabal of the Washington, the permanent Washington, which includes the mainstream media, which includes their friends in big tech and social media, which includes their friends in the national security state, all of whom have a vested interest in Joe Biden getting elected, not because they think he's some great, fantastic leader who's going to save this country, but because him remaining in power allows them to maintain their power. So it's an insult to voters that they're not willing to allow us to be able to question and examine him and his record. It's an insult to voters when you look at how blatantly they are rigging the system. We talked a little bit earlier about how they did it a little more subtly when I ran for president Democratic primary in 2020. It's just blatant now. They're just saying, nope, we will not allow this democracy to work as it should by having our candidates debate. We're giving you one choice and one choice only, and that is Joe Biden. But then that leads to the next step, which is Joe Biden. If Joe Biden gets reelected, what happens next? Very quickly, I can imagine we will see a Vice President Kamala Harris become President Kamala Harris, and she becomes the next puppet for the permanent Washington to be able to control.
And I think she's demonstrated that she would be, people talk about Joe Biden and his age and competency, but when we see Vice President Harris, she doesn't, I'm not real confident in anything she has to say. In fact, most of the time when she's speaking, I have a tough time, even when it's kind of a gimme speech, in front of supporters, figuring out what she's even trying to say. But I think what you said is that combined issue is that Washington, the establishment there, all of those different elements of it, not just the political parties, but also the media, the corporate interest, they're okay now with having leaders like that who aren't bold, who can't answer questions, who don't speak and kind of inspire Americans, but instead just kind of mumble along, but put in the people that they want and go along with the policies that they're asking for without question.
You're right. That's exactly right. It's not even a question. Well, are they looking for bold and courageous leaders who can be decisive and ensure the safety, security, and freedom of our country? They are looking for people who they can control, because what we're talking about is a whole level of corrupt people who are pulling the strings behind the curtain. And so no, they don't care about capabilities. They don't care about qualifications. They don't care about having someone who can make that decision to pull us back from the brink of nuclear war that President Biden and his administration has brought us to. You look at Kamala Harris, you're right. She can hardly string together words that make sense over and over. So there's a capability, a problem at a basic level. But let's look at the more serious issue. Can you imagine President Kamala Harris as commander-in-chief making decisions about the lives of our men and women in uniform, my brothers and sisters in uniform, making the decisions about war and peace, the life and death of people around the world? This is an incredibly dangerous proposition. We've seen how dangerous the Biden administration has already been. Kamala Harris as president and commander-in-chief would be catastrophic for our country and the world.
I agree. I mean, I think that, early on, it seemed like Democrats realized that and said, maybe we don't need her as vice president if he does decide to run again. But now they've kind of gone all in. I think it's because of what we already discussed. They know they can control these folks, so they choose that over competency. And so they keep Mayorkas in. Because I wanted to ask you about something, substantive to this policy issue. There's a whistleblower yesterday. This just makes me sad for our country. And who comes right out of HHS, was sent to the border, goes to Congress and says, we are a middleman right now, the U.S. government, in child trafficking. And of course, we're finding kids in factories all across America. The Biden administration, they shrug their shoulders, say, we don't see those. We don't think that's a real problem.
They don't think that's a real problem. They don't think their open border policies are a real problem. They say without any smirk on their face that they think that the border is secure. All of these different examples lead to the fact that we have an administration with people who are unwilling to recognize the truth or unwilling to speak the truth, and therefore incapable of actually solving the very real problems that the American people face. That is what needs to confront Democrats, Republicans, independents. Those who care about this country need to examine the facts very carefully as we decide who will be our next president.
We're going to continue to do that. Tulsi, we appreciate you joining the Sekulow broadcast team and the insight you're going to provide each week as we go through this process. And we're about to, go through the political process. We've got the issues all abroad. And I think, your voice is very important for our audience and for our supporters to hear. So we appreciate you joining the team.